Starting today, you report to him.
You took my authority and kept my responsibility?
We just lost emergency routing. 3 priority loads are stalled.
That's exactly what I warned you about.
The first thing Simone Carter noticed was that someone had moved her nameplate. It sat face down beside the conference room speaker, the brushed aluminum catching the white glare from the ceiling panels. Simone stopped just inside the glass door, one hand still wrapped around the notebook she carried to every Monday operations review. At 42, she had spent 9 years building Meridian Supply Group's Mid-Atlantic Distribution Division from the company's worst performer into its most reliable one. Her dark braids were pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her navy blazer still carrying a faint trace of cold warehouse air from the morning floor walk. Around the table, 6 department leads avoided looking directly at her. At the head of the table sat Garrett Vale, Meridian's CEO. Beside him was a young man Simone recognized from a company holiday photograph, though she had never seen him inside the Baltimore facility. Owen Vale, 28, Garrett's nephew, wore a charcoal suit that still had the tailor's crease in the sleeves. There was no laptop in front of him, no operations binder, not even the laminated emergency routing card every division leader was required to carry during hurricane season. "Simone," Garrett said, giving her the pleasant voice he used when he had already made the decision. "Have a seat. We're adjusting the leadership structure." Her chair was occupied by Owen. Simone took the empty seat near the end of the table instead. Adjusting how? Garrett slid a printed page toward her. The heading read Regional Leadership Realignment. Her title, Division General Manager, appeared beneath Owen's name. Simone's new title was Senior Operations Advisor, a position she had never heard discussed, with no direct reports and no approval authority over staffing, transportation, inventory exceptions, or vendor allocation. Those 4 functions were the reason her division had survived 2 port disruptions and a warehouse fire without missing a hospital delivery window. Owen offered her a quick smile. "I'm hoping you'll help me get up to speed." Simone looked at Garrett instead. "When does this take effect?" "Today." Across the table, Warehouse Director Luis Mendoza shifted in his chair. Simone caught the movement without turning toward him. Luis had worked beside her through the worst year the division had ever seen, when damaged conveyor equipment forced them to route thousands of medical supply orders manually. He knew what the page in front of her meant. So did Priya Shah from Transportation. Neither spoke. Garrett leaned back. "This isn't a reflection on performance. Your numbers are excellent. Best in the company, actually. But Owen brings a different kind of perspective, and we think the division is ready for more strategic leadership." Simone let that sentence settle. 3 years earlier, Garrett had called her operational when she requested a seat on the Corporate Planning Council. 6 months later, he had praised a white regional director for being strategic. After that man adopted the inventory forecasting model Simone's team had developed. She had noticed the pattern then and chosen not to make a war out of every slight. There had always been another shipment, another staffing gap, another problem worth solving. She tapped the realignment page once. "What operating experience does Owen have?" Garrett's expression tightened slightly. "He spent 4 years in consulting. That wasn't what I asked." Owen glanced toward his uncle, then back to her. "I worked with several logistics clients." Simone nodded. "Did you run any of their facilities?" "No, but management isn't about knowing every technical detail." Priya finally looked up. Her pen had stopped moving. Garrett stepped in before Simone could answer. "This is exactly why we want you involved. Owen handles leadership. You provide continuity." Continuity. The word almost made her laugh. Meridian's corporate office had never understood how much of the division's stability lived outside official procedure. Simone knew which hospital systems could accept split deliveries after midnight, which trucking contractors became unreliable during ice warnings, which warehouse supervisors could rebuild a broken picking sequence without waiting for IT. She had spent years turning that knowledge into training, checklists, backup routes, and cross-qualified teams precisely so the place would not depend on one person. But the work was not finished, and Garrett knew less about those gaps than he believed. Simone opened her notebook to the page marked Monday. Then I need one thing clarified in writing. Am I still accountable for division performance? Garrett hesitated. Owen answered first. We all are. That isn't an operating structure. Simone kept her voice even. If I have responsibility without authority, I need the boundaries documented. The room became still in a different way, not shocked, alert. Garrett pulled the page back toward himself. You're making this more adversarial than it needs to be. Simone studied him for a moment, then closed her notebook. She had spent too many years teaching supervisors that unclear authority caused preventable failures to pretend the rules stopped applying when the CEO's family was involved. Send me the final reporting structure, she said. I'll review it before I accept the new role. Garrett's jaw shifted. The reassignment isn't optional. That was the first decision he made that morning he could not easily undo. By 11:30, the revised reporting chart had reached Simone's inbox. Garrett had removed the ambiguity by making the structure worse. Owen would hold final approval over staffing, transportation contracts, inventory exceptions, emergency rerouting, and customer escalation. Simone, as senior operations advisor, would be expected to support execution, knowledge transfer, and performance continuity. The phrase sat on the page like a joke written by someone who had never spent 12 hours deciding which refrigerated shipment got the last available truck. She read the document twice, then forwarded it to her personal counsel with a note asking only whether declining the reassignment would affect accrued compensation. She did not mention discrimination, not yet. She wanted the company's own paper trail before anyone started polishing the language. At noon, Owen appeared beside her office door, carrying a coffee and the confidence of a man who had been told the difficult part was already handled. Got 5 minutes? Simone gestured toward the chair across from her desk. Her wall held no awards, though there were several in storage. What she kept visible were a regional storm map, a handwritten list of emergency carrier contacts, and a photograph of her daughter Maya standing beside a science fair display about bridge loads. Owen looked at the map before sitting. Uncle Garrett says you built most of the contingency system here, most of the current one. Great. I want to simplify it. Simone waited. Owen opened a presentation on his tablet. He wanted to consolidate secondary carriers, reduce warehouse labor buffers, and eliminate what he called legacy exceptions. The savings looked attractive because the spreadsheet treated every inactive backup contract as waste. Simone pointed to one carrier scheduled for removal. Harbor Freight Lines is our only vendor certified for overnight temperature-controlled emergency transfer from this facility. We've used them twice in 18 months. That's why they're a backup. He smiled, as if she had made his argument for him. Exactly. We're paying for capacity we barely use. Simone felt the first real flicker of anger since the meeting, not because he was inexperienced, but because he was incurious. Inexperience could be trained. Certainty was harder. She explained the hospital contracts, the storm clauses, and the 3-hour restoration commitment triggered by certain supply interruptions. Owen listened for perhaps 40 seconds before glancing at his tablet again. I get the history, but Garrett wants me to make decisions, not inherit every old precaution. It isn't history if the obligation is still in the contract. He leaned back. See, this is what he meant. What did he mean? That you're very protective of the way you've always done things. Simone looked at him long enough that he shifted the coffee cup between his hands. There it was, the first rewrite. She was no longer the manager whose division led the company in fulfillment, margin stability, and emergency performance. She was resistant to change. Before she could answer, Luis appeared in the doorway with a printed dispatch sheet. Sorry, we've got an issue on Dock 6. Simone stood automatically, then stopped herself. Owen noticed. What kind of issue? 2 outbound hospital loads were assigned the same refrigerated trailer. Dispatch caught it before loading. Owen rose. I'll handle it. Luis looked at Simone, then quickly back at Owen. Okay. On the warehouse floor, the air smelled faintly of cardboard, diesel residue, and the citrus cleaner used around the cold storage doors. Forklift warning tones pulsed between aisles. Owen asked the dispatcher why the software had duplicated the trailer assignment. The dispatcher, a woman named Renee who had worked nights for 6 years, explained that a maintenance hold had removed one trailer from the pool after the morning allocation run. So reassign another one, Owen said. We don't have another qualified reefer on site. Then use a standard trailer. Renee blinked. For temperature-controlled medical product? Owen's face changed when he realized several people had heard him. I mean temporarily if packaging tolerances allow. Simone said nothing. She knew the product did not allow it, but Garrett had made Owen the approving authority, and Owen needed to ask the right question himself. Instead, he turned to her. What would you normally do? The wording mattered. Not what should we do. What would you normally do? Check the emergency carrier list, Simone said. Owen's mouth tightened. The list you said we shouldn't cut. The list the contract requires us to maintain. Renee had already pulled up the carrier panel. Harbor Freight Lines showed one certified unit available 40 minutes away. Owen stared at the screen, then authorized the call without acknowledging anything else. By 3, the hospital loads were back on schedule. The small crisis had ended cleanly, which should have made it forgettable. Instead, Garrett called Simone upstairs. He had Owen's account of the warehouse incident open on his screen. The subject line read, Leadership Transition Concern. Garrett folded his hands. Owen says you undermined him in front of staff. Simone felt something inside the day become simpler. How? You let him walk into a problem you already knew how to solve. You reassigned the authority to him this morning. That doesn't mean you stop cooperating. I gave him the exact information he asked for. Garrett frowned. This is the attitude I was worried about. If you're going to make the transition difficult because you disagree with the decision, we'll have to document that. Simone looked at the screen, then at him. Please do. For the first time, Garrett seemed unsure whether he had heard her correctly. She stood. And send me a copy. By the time Simone returned to her office, the first formal note in her personnel file had already been entered. The personnel note arrived at 3:17 p.m., 6 minutes after Simone sat down. It described the Dock 6 incident as a failure to proactively support newly appointed leadership during an operational disruption and said her conduct had created avoidable confusion among staff. Simone read it once, then opened the refrigerated load dispatch record. The timestamps showed Renee had discovered the trailer conflict at 1:42, Owen had reached the dock at 1:49, and Harbor Freight had been authorized at 1:57. No delay. No missed service window. She saved the dispatch record beside Garrett's memo and requested the company's formal procedure for responding to personnel documentation. Human Resources replied 20 minutes later with a link to the employee portal and a note from Dana Whitfield, the corporate HR director. Simone could submit a written response within 5 business days, but the note itself would remain in her file. Dana added that reassignment decisions fell within executive discretion unless compensation or employment status materially changed. Simone appreciated the precision. It gave her something better than reassurance: boundaries. She printed the reporting chart, Garrett's memo, and the HR instructions, then placed them in a slim folder instead of carrying the thick operations binder she had used for years. Luis came in shortly before 4. You're not really going to let that memo sit there. I'm going to answer it. That's not what I mean. He shut the door halfway, then stopped and left it open again. Simone noticed the correction. People were already thinking about how ordinary actions might look later. Luis lowered his voice. Everyone on the dock knows what happened. Knowing isn't the same as being willing to say it. He looked toward the warehouse windows. Rent day will. Simone shook her head. Don't recruit witnesses for me. If anyone is asked, they tell what they saw. Nothing more. She had made that mistake once early in her career, pressing a supervisor to support a complaint before he was ready. He had withdrawn completely, and the friendship between them never recovered. She would not turn frightened employees into pieces on a board simply because she needed them. At 4:26, Owen sent his first division-wide instruction. Effective immediately, all secondary transportation agreements were to be reviewed for suspension. and managers were prohibited from authorizing emergency carriers without his written approval. Simone stared at the line longer than she intended. The wording was broad enough to catch the exact contingency Harbor Freight had filled 3 hours earlier. More importantly, Owen had issued it without separating discretionary backup vendors from carriers attached to customer service obligations. She walked to his temporary office. "You need to revise the emergency carrier language." Owen did not look up from his laptop. "We talked about this. We talked about one vendor. This instruction covers all of them. And now there's a review. Some contracts require active contingency capacity while the customer agreement is in force." That got his attention. "Which contracts?" Simone could have answered from memory. She knew 3 of them immediately and suspected a 4th. Instead, she said, "The matrix is in the contract repository under continuity obligations. You have access now." His expression hardened. "You could just tell me." "I could tell you what I remember. You're the approving authority. You should verify what binds the division before suspending anything." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Owen closed his laptop halfway. "Do you understand how this looks? Every time I make a decision, you find a technical reason it can't work." Simone almost answered too quickly. The irritation rose before the judgment did. "Maybe stop making decisions before you understand the technical reasons." The sentence came out sharper than she intended. Owen's face changed, and Simone knew immediately she had given him something usable. Not proof that he was right, but a clean example of her frustration. She could not take it back without pretending she had not meant part of it. "That," he said, "is exactly the problem." Simone rubbed a thumb along the folder edge. "The way I said it was unnecessary. The contract issue is still real." He opened the laptop again. "I'll review it." She returned to her office angry with him and, inconveniently, with herself. At 5:11, Dana from HR called. Garrett had asked that Simone's transition conduct be formally reviewed before the end of the week. Dana sounded uncomfortable but careful. She asked whether Simone wished to submit anything immediately. "Yes," Simone said. "The reporting chart, the Doc 6 dispatch timestamps, and Owen's carrier directive." Dana paused. "Are you alleging discriminatory treatment?" Simone looked through the glass toward the floor she had run for nearly a decade. Forklifts moved between lanes with the practiced spacing her team had built into every shift. "I'm documenting a pattern," she said. "You can decide what your process calls it." Before leaving that evening, Simone completed one more form. It was not a complaint. It was a formal request to preserve every document connected to her reassignment and the leadership transition. Simone filed the preservation request at 5:38 p.m. and left the building 22 minutes later, carrying nothing but her handbag and the slim folder. For years, leaving Meridian before 7 had felt like abandoning a shift midstream. That evening, she forced herself not to turn around. The loading yard lights had come on against the early winter dusk, throwing pale rectangles across the trailers while diesel engines idled near the gate. She knew which outbound loads were still waiting for seals. She also knew they were no longer hers to approve. At home, Maya had spread engineering worksheets across the kitchen table beside a half-built model bridge made from basswood strips. "You're early," she said, suspicious enough to make Simone smile despite herself. Simone set down her keys and inspected the crooked center span. Maya was 17 and had inherited her mother's dislike of explanations that arrived after mistakes. "The load path is wrong," Simone said. Maya pointed the pencil at her. "You have been home 40 seconds. Simone laughed, then caught herself wondering when she had last been home early enough to annoy her daughter before dinner. They cooked pasta while Simone gave a carefully shortened version of the day. She left out Garrett's wording and most of Owen's mistakes, but Maya understood the shape of it anyway. "So they gave your job to his nephew and want you to teach him how to do it?" she asked. Simone drained the pasta. "That is one interpretation." Maya stared at her. "Mom." Simone let the steam fog her glasses before answering. Yes, the admission hurt more in her own kitchen than it had in the conference room. Her phone buzzed with a message from Luis. Owen had scheduled a 7-line AM meeting to review labor reductions and carrier suspensions. Luis added a second line, "We need you there." Simone typed that she would attend if requested, then deleted it. She was still employed, still drawing a salary, and still responsible for legitimate advisory duties. Refusing everything could make Garrett's version easier to defend. She finally wrote, "I'll come if Owen includes me. Don't make this a loyalty test for the team." Luis called immediately. "You think this is about loyalty? I think people are frightened and starting to choose sides before they know what the consequences are. They already chose a side when they replaced you." "No." Garrett chose. Owen accepted. "Everybody else still has a job to do." Luis exhaled hard. "That's easy for you to say. You can resign." The word struck harder because Simone had been trying not to think it. Her employment agreement included a resignation provision she had negotiated 3 years earlier, after corporate repeatedly delayed funding for division upgrades. If she left voluntarily with proper notice, Meridian retained its equipment and systems, but several discretionary operating responsibilities reverted to corporate review until a qualified division manager was certified. It was not leverage she had designed as a weapon. It was a safeguard against exactly what headquarters was now pretending did not matter. "I'm not resigning tonight," she said. "I didn't say tonight." Luis went quiet. Simone regretted the accusation before he answered. "I meant you have options the rest of us don't." That was true, and she had treated it like disloyalty. She apologized without dressing it up. Luis accepted, but not warmly. Before hanging up, he told her something else. Owen had asked IT for administrator access to the division's contingency matrix. Normally, that would have been routine after a leadership change. The problem was timing. The request had been submitted 15 minutes after Simone's preservation notice. At 7:46, Simone opened her laptop at the kitchen table while Maya adjusted the bridge supports beside her. The company system showed her preservation request as received, but not yet acknowledged. She downloaded the confirmation receipt and stopped there. She could still access the contingency repository, but copying internal material to a personal device would create an unnecessary issue. Preservation meant protecting the record through the proper channel, not taking whatever she wanted because she feared someone else might mishandle it. The next morning, Dana called before Simone reached the facility. Her voice had lost the careful neutrality from the day before. "I need to tell you something before you walk in. Your preservation request triggered an automatic legal hold." "That's what I expected." "Yes, but legal expanded it." Simone slowed near the employee entrance. "Expanded it to what?" "Leadership appointment records for the Mid-Atlantic Division, hiring criteria, succession discussions, compensation reviews, and prior promotion decisions going back 3 years. The warehouse doors opened as a pallet jack crossed the receiving lane inside. Simone could hear the familiar warning beep through the glass. Dana continued. "There's another issue. You were not the first person to question how senior roles in your division were being filled." Simone stopped with her badge still in her hand. What had begun as the removal of one manager was now attached to a record someone else had already started. Dana would not tell Simone who had raised the earlier concern. Legal had instructed her to preserve names until interviews began, and Simone did not press. She entered the building at 7:02, badge reader chirping against the metal frame, and found the conference room already half full. Owen stood beside a screen displaying a cost reduction model. Garrett had joined by video from headquarters. No one mentioned the legal hold. Owen began with labor. He wanted to eliminate 12 cross-trained warehouse positions over the next quarter and replace part of the coverage with temporary staffing. On the spreadsheet, the proposal reduced payroll without changing projected throughput. Simone recognized the assumption immediately. Cross-trained workers were not extra capacity. They were the people who shifted between receiving, cold storage, and outbound lanes when equipment failed or order volume spiked. Removing them would not hurt an average Tuesday. It would hurt the first Tuesday that stopped being average. Luis asked who had validated the model against seasonal demand. Owen said corporate finance had reviewed it. Finance reviewed the savings, Simone said. Who reviewed the operating assumptions? Owen's eyes moved toward her. Garrett answered from the screen. This meeting isn't another opportunity to relitigate the leadership decision. Simone kept her attention on the spreadsheet. I'm asking about the staffing decision. The distinction seemed to irritate him more than an argument would have. Owen advanced to transportation. 5 secondary carriers were marked for suspension, including Harbor Freight. Simone saw Priya stop writing. Before those are suspended, Simone said, you need contract review on the hospital accounts tied to emergency capacity. Owen replied that he had checked the repository and found no clause requiring Harbor specifically. I never said Harbor specifically. She pointed to the category header on the screen. The obligation is certified replacement capacity within the restoration window. If you remove enough qualified carriers, you can breach the service requirement without missing a scheduled delivery first. Garrett leaned toward his camera. This is the behavior we discussed. Every proposal becomes a catastrophe when Simone explains it. For a moment, she nearly let anger choose her answer. Then she heard Maya's voice from the kitchen the night before. Mom. The simple refusal to let Simone hide behind polished language. She looked at Garrett. No. Most proposals are manageable. These two haven't been tested against the conditions they're supposed to survive. Owen folded his arms. Then test them. The room shifted towards Simone automatically, and she disliked how familiar that felt. She could have taken control, assigned scenarios, and proved the point before lunch. That would also let everyone keep pretending Owen held authority while she carried responsibility beneath it. I can advise on the test, she said. You need to run it. Owen stared at her. Fine. They moved to the operations lab beside dispatch, where a wall monitor could replay archived demand patterns against current staffing and carrier capacity. Renee loaded a winter surge from 2 years earlier, stripping customer names and confidential fields. Owen chose his proposed staffing level and carrier pool. The first simulation completed without trouble. Garrett, still connected by speaker, gave a short laugh. There, useful exercise. Simone said nothing. The first scenario assumed all equipment available. Renee loaded the second run with 1 conveyor down and a 6-hour freezing rain delay on the western route. By simulated hour 3, receiving backed into the staging lanes. By hour 5, 2 temperature-controlled orders had no qualified replacement carrier. The system flagged a restoration window failure in amber, then red. Owen stepped closer to the monitor. Can we reroute through Richmond? Priya answered before Simone could. Not under the proposed carrier cuts. Richmond loses the same backup pool. The third run was worse. One absent cold storage supervisor forced a temporary worker into a task requiring certification the model assumed, but the staffing plan did not provide. Renee stopped the simulation before the violation completed. Nobody needed Simone to explain it. Owen looked at the screen for a long time. So the savings model is wrong. Not exactly, Simone said. The savings are real. So are the risks it excluded. That answer seemed to bother Garrett. We're not running a company based on every unlikely event. Luis turned from the monitor. Those events are why this division became the best one you have. Garrett's voice sharpened. Luis, stay in your lane. Luis did not answer, but this time he did not look away either. At 9:14, Dana appeared at the lab door with Meridian's deputy general counsel beside her. He asked Owen to pause all staffing and carrier changes pending review. Then he handed Garrett, through the camera and the silence around it, a second instruction. No further personnel action involving Simone could proceed without legal approval. The hold was no longer protecting only documents. It was now limiting what Garrett could do next. The Deputy General Counsel introduced himself as Marcus Hale and asked everyone except Simone, Owen, Dana, and Priya to return to work. Garrett remained on the conference screen, visibly irritated by being treated as one participant among several. Marcus did not apologize for the interruption. He opened a legal pad and asked Priya to explain exactly how the simulation inputs had been selected. She walked him through archived demand, weather delays, carrier certification, and staffing assumptions. When Marcus asked whether Simone had altered any parameters after seeing Owen's plan, Priya answered before Simone could. No, she didn't touch the console. Owen shifted beside the monitor. Nobody accused her of manipulating anything. Marcus looked at him. I'm establishing what happened. He then asked who had approved the proposed reductions. Owen said he had, based on a model corporate finance provided. Garrett cut in to say the plan was preliminary and had never been intended for immediate implementation. Priya glanced at the screen where Owen's division-wide instruction from the previous afternoon was still visible in the archived message pane. Simone saw Marcus notice the glance. Was this preliminary? Marcus asked. Owen hesitated. It was subject to review. That wasn't the question. Garrett's voice came through the speaker with a faint digital crackle. Marcus, if legal is going to turn ordinary management decisions into depositions, we're going to paralyze the business. Marcus wrote something down. The business is already under a preservation hold concerning the leadership transition. I'm trying to prevent additional facts from becoming disputed. Simone had expected satisfaction when someone finally stopped Garrett from controlling the language. Instead, she felt tired. The morning had begun before 7, and she still had 3 unanswered customer escalations waiting in the advisory queue. She asked whether she could return to those while legal continued its review. Marcus nodded, then added that she should not delete, alter, or relocate any transition-related material. I haven't, Simone said. Dana confirmed that the system log showed no unusual copying or external transfer from Simone's account. Back in her office, Simone found an email from a major hospital network requesting clarification on Meridian's winter continuity capacity. The timing was ordinary. Annual certification season had begun 2 weeks earlier. Under her old role, she could have signed the response after Priya verified carrier coverage. Now the approval belonged to Owen. Simone prepared the supporting data, attached the current carrier matrix, and sent him a recommendation without signing the certification herself. 10 minutes later, he appeared at her door. You could sign this in 30 seconds. I don't have authority anymore. You know the information is accurate. I know what I reviewed. The certification makes the division manager responsible for the representation. Owen dropped into the chair across from her. For the first time since arriving, he looked younger than his suit. Do you enjoy this? Simone frowned. Enjoy what? Watching me discover everything I don't know. She almost dismissed the question. Then she remembered Luis telling her that options were not distributed equally. Owen had accepted a position he had not earned, but Garrett had also placed him inside a machine whose controls no one had bothered to explain. That did not excuse the arrogance. It did make the situation less simple. No, Simone said. I would have preferred not to be replaced. Owen looked toward Maya's bridge photograph. I didn't ask him to remove you. You accepted the job after he did. He nodded once. Yeah. It was the first answer he had given her without defending himself. Simone slid the certification back across the desk. Then start acting like the person who accepted it. Read the continuity schedule, confirm the qualified capacity, and sign only what you can support. Owen took the packet with him. At 11:40, Dana asked Simone to join Marcus in a smaller conference room. A printed promotion summary lay between them. 3 years earlier, when Garrett had denied Simone a place on Meridian's corporate planning council, the written explanation said she needed broader strategic exposure. Marcus placed another document beside it. A succession recommendation from the same year, written by a former executive vice president who had retired soon afterward. The recommendation described Simone as the strongest internal candidate for expanded regional leadership and specifically praised her strategic planning during the warehouse fire. Simone read the paragraph twice. Who saw this? She asked. Dana answered quietly. Garrett. Marcus turned over one more page. Attached to the recommendation was a handwritten note scanned into the archived file. Strong operator. Keep her where she's most useful. The initials at the bottom were Garrett Vales. Simone sat back. The paper did not prove why he had limited her advancement, and Marcus said so immediately. It did, however, contradict the explanation placed in her review. More important, it connected her current demotion to an older decision that legal could now test against other promotions. Marcus closed the folder. We are expanding the review beyond the reassignment. Simone looked through the glass wall toward the division floor, where Owen stood beside Priya reading the continuity packet instead of handing it back to someone else. For the first time, the question was no longer whether Simone could prove she deserved the job she had already done. It was whether Meridian could explain why it had repeatedly refused to see her doing it. Marcus scheduled the accountability review for that afternoon, not because he expected a final decision in a few hours, but because two different problems now overlapped. Simone's reassignment and the accuracy of the records Meridian had used to justify earlier advancement decisions. He asked Dana to bring promotion files for comparable regional leaders, Finance to supply the original staffing assumptions, and Owen to bring the continuity certification he had spent the morning reviewing. Simone arrived with only her notebook. She had already learned that carrying every document herself made it too easy for people to treat the dispute as her private case instead of the company's responsibility to verify its own decisions. The meeting began in the operations lab rather than the executive conference room. Marcus had chosen the location deliberately. The wall monitor still held the winter simulation template, and through the interior windows they could see trailers moving across the yard. Garrett joined in person this time, having driven down from headquarters. He objected before sitting. "If this is about personnel files, why are we doing it next to dispatch?" Marcus answered without looking up from his notes. Because the stated reason for the leadership change was strategic capability. We need to understand what that means in this division. Dana started with Simone's promotion history. Over 3 years, 2 men had been elevated into broader regional roles after reviews that praised strategic readiness. One had weaker operating results than Simone. The other had never managed a distribution facility. Marcus was careful with the comparison. Different jobs, different timing, different sponsors. None of it proved discriminatory intent by itself. But when Dana placed the written reasons beside Simone's reviews, the language shifted in ways Garrett had difficulty explaining. Simone was repeatedly praised for execution while being denied opportunities on the ground that she lacked the strategic exposure those opportunities would have provided. Garrett leaned forward. "You're making normal development language sound sinister." "I'm testing whether it was applied consistently," Marcus said. He then asked Owen to explain the continuity obligation in the hospital contracts. Owen opened the packet Simone had sent him and described the requirement in his own words. Meridian did not have to retain any particular carrier, but the division had to maintain enough certified backup capacity to restore temperature-controlled service inside the contractual window. Marcus asked how many of the proposed suspensions would have reduced that capacity. Owen checked the matrix before answering. 3. "And did you know that yesterday?" "No," Garrett interrupted, which is why Simone was still here to advise him. Simone felt Luis shift beside the observation window, where Marcus had asked him and Priya to wait until called. She kept her attention on Garrett. Marcus asked, was Simone authorized to prevent Owen from issuing the directive? "No," Garrett said. "Could she sign the customer certification after the reassignment?" Garrett hesitated. "Technically, no. So she had responsibility for continuity without the authority to stop a change or certify the result? That's an oversimplification." Owen spoke before Marcus could respond. "It's accurate." Garrett turned toward him. "Owen, I made the carrier decision." Owen's voice was less polished than it had been Monday morning. "She told me to check the contracts. I thought she was protecting old processes." She wasn't. The admission did not absolve him. Simone knew that, and apparently Owen did too. Marcus asked whether anyone had pressured him to describe the Dock 6 incident as resistance from Simone. Owen looked at the tabletop. Uncle Garrett asked whether she had cooperated. "I said she let me handle it." He said that sounded like she was making a point. Garrett's chair scraped slightly. "I was trying to understand a difficult transition." Dana slid the personnel memo across the table. "Then why does the final note say she created avoidable operational confusion when the dispatch timestamps show no delay?" Garrett read the page as if seeing it for the first time. That was HR language. Dana's expression changed. "No, You sent me that wording. The room did not erupt. That made the moment harder to escape. Marcus asked Dana to pull the email from the preserved file. She did. Garrett's message appeared on the monitor with the disputed sentence nearly word for word. Simone felt no triumph. She thought instead about how close she had come to resigning the night before, taking the clean exit because fighting for a job stripped of authority had felt humiliating. If she had left then, the record would still exist, but Garrett's version might have become the first version everyone remembered. Marcus closed his notebook. Effective immediately, Owen remains in the role only for routine decisions under operational supervision. No staffing reduction, carrier suspension, customer certification change, or personnel action proceeds without secondary approval. Garrett, you are recused from decisions concerning Simone until the independent review is complete. Garrett stared at him. You don't have authority to recuse the CEO. Not permanently, Marcus said. The board's audit chair does. He turned the monitor toward Garrett. An acknowledgement had arrived 12 minutes earlier. The restriction was temporary, but it was real. Simone finally spoke. I want one more thing documented. Marcus looked at her. The division doesn't need me restored just to prove Garrett was wrong. It needs a qualified authority structure before the next disruption. Outside the glass, a dock alarm sounded twice, followed by the mechanical rumble of a trailer locking into place. For the first time all week, the next decision would have to survive more than one person's confidence. The board's audit chair issued the formal interim decision at 8:10 the next morning. Garrett would remain CEO, but any employment action involving Simone, Owen's appointment, or the Mid-Atlantic succession process required approval from a 3-person review committee. Owen stayed in the general manager role under temporary operational oversight from another regional executive. The arrangement was awkward, but Marcus had been explicit. An investigation was not a verdict, and removing people before the facts were complete would reproduce the same kind of careless decision-making they were examining. Simone read the notice in Dana's office while the warehouse began its morning cycle below them. She had expected relief. Instead, she felt the dull weight of realizing that her own future remained unresolved. Her title was still Senior Operations Advisor. Her authority was still gone. Meridian had protected her from another disciplinary memo, but it had not restored what Garrett had taken. Dana seemed to recognize the distinction. The committee wants to interview you this afternoon. Simone folded the notice once. I'll be there. Then she added, I'm not asking them to punish Owen for not knowing what Garrett never required him to know. Dana studied her. That's generous. No, it's accurate. The first operational consequence arrived before lunch. A forecasted freezing front shifted south, increasing the probability of road closures across western Maryland. Under the previous week's plan, Priya would have activated secondary carriers without discussion. Under Owen's original directive, she would have needed his written approval for each one. The interim structure required something different. Owen would approve the response, but a certified regional operator had to validate the continuity steps. The oversight executive was 2 states away, so Owen asked Simone to serve as the technical reviewer without transferring decision authority back to her. He brought the weather packet to her office himself. I checked the restoration clauses first. Simone looked through the carrier list. Harbor Freight had 1 unit available. 2 other qualified carriers could hold capacity through midnight for a standby fee. You're reserving both? I was going to reserve one. Why? Cost. She nodded toward the storm projection. And if the western route closes 2 hours earlier than forecast. Owen looked at the map again. He did not defend the first answer. Then one isn't enough. That's how I read it. He authorized both. The decision cost several $1,000s for capacity they might never use. Nobody congratulated him. That was part of operations, too. Sometimes the correct choice looked inefficient until the alternative became expensive. By mid-afternoon, the committee interview had moved from Simone's reassignment to her employment history. Marcus asked about the planning council denial, the succession recommendation, and Garrett's description of her as resistant to strategic change. Simone answered with dates and decisions where she could. When asked whether she believed race had influenced Garrett, she did not soften the answer merely because she could not prove his thoughts. "I believe I was held to standards that shifted when I met them," she said. "I also know belief isn't the same as evidence. That's why you're reviewing the comparisons." The audit chair, Elaine Porter, asked what resolution Simone wanted if the investigation supported her concerns. Simone had rehearsed several versions of that answer during the drive-in. None survived the question. "I don't want my old job handed back as an apology," she said. "I want the appointment process reviewed, the false personnel note corrected, and the division led by someone qualified under standards that existed before a family member needed a position." Elaine leaned forward. "Would you apply if the role reopened?" Simone hesitated. 3 days earlier, she would have said yes before the question ended. Now she thought of Maya's bridge on the kitchen table, of dinners she had skipped, of 9 years spent making herself indispensable to a company that had treated that indispensability as a reason to keep her in place. "I don't know," she said. The uncertainty frightened her more than anger had. At 6:20 that evening, the freezing rain reached the western corridor sooner than forecast. One primary carrier suspended departures. Owen activated the 2 reserved backups, and both hospital loads moved without missing their restoration windows. The system logged the change automatically. No emergency meeting followed. No executive speech appeared in anyone's inbox. Priya simply updated the dispatch board. The next morning, a new laminated procedure hung beside it. Leadership changes could no longer suspend emergency capacity until contractual obligations had been independently checked and signed. It was the first correction Meridian had made that would remain useful after Simone's name disappeared from the argument. By Friday afternoon, the temporary procedure beside the dispatch board had already picked up 2 coffee stains and a handwritten correction from Priya. Simone noticed both while walking the floor with the independent review team. That pleased her more than the polished version legal had circulated upstairs. A rule people actually used was allowed to look used. Near receiving, one of the cross-trained supervisors showed Elaine Porter how staffing reductions would have affected a shift change during a conveyor failure. Elaine asked questions without trying to compress every answer into a board summary, and Simone found herself trusting the process a little more because of that. The review committee issued its findings the following Tuesday. Dana asked Simone to come to the same conference room where Garrett had announced the realignment 8 days earlier. Her nameplate was back on the table, up upright this time, though no one had placed it at the head. Garrett sat 2 seats away from Elaine, with Marcus beside him. Owen had been invited because the findings covered his appointment, but not every decision he had made after it. He looked exhausted. Simone suspected he had spent the week discovering how many small judgments kept the division from becoming a spreadsheet with forklifts. Elaine began with the personnel note. The characterization of the Dock 6 event was unsupported by the operating record. It will be removed from Ms. Carter's file and replaced with a correction stating that no service delay resulted from her conduct. Garrett shifted but said nothing. The committee had also reviewed 3 years of succession decisions. The pattern was not as simple as one memo or one phrase. Several candidates had different qualifications, and some decisions were defensible. Others were not. Simone had repeatedly been denied developmental opportunities because she supposedly lacked strategic exposure, while less experienced employees were given broader assignments precisely to gain it. The committee found that Garrett had exercised succession authority inconsistently and had failed to follow Meridian's conflict of interest process before sponsoring Owen for the Mid-Atlantic role. Elaine chose her next words with care. The review found sufficient evidence of unequal treatment and a flawed appointment process. It did not find that every adverse decision can be attributed to a single motive. Simone appreciated the sentence. It did not demand that reality become cleaner than it was. Garrett finally spoke. "So after all this, you're saying I made judgment errors?" "I'm saying more than that," Elaine replied. You used standards differently depending on the candidate, then documented some of those decisions inaccurately. And you participated directly in appointing a relative without the independent review our governance policy required. The board had removed succession and senior promotion authority from Garrett for 12 months. Future regional appointments would require documented criteria, at least 2 reviewers outside the sponsoring executive's chain, and conflict screening before interviews began. Garrett would remain CEO, but his annual evaluation would include the findings, and part of his incentive compensation would be withheld pending completion of the governance reforms. Owen's appointment was voided. He did not argue. The division manager position would reopen under the new process, with a certified interim manager arriving the following Monday. Owen could return to corporate in a non-supervisory project role if he chose. Before Elaine moved on, Owen looked at Simone. "I'm sorry," she waited. He swallowed. "Not because I didn't know everything. I wasn't supposed to. I'm sorry because I treated not knowing as if it proved everyone else was protecting old habits." Simone nodded once. That part matters. It was not forgiveness. It was an accurate name for what he had done. Garrett's apology came later, after the meeting had ended and most people had left. He stopped Simone near the glass wall overlooking outbound staging. "I thought keeping you here was recognizing how valuable you were." She looked at him. "You kept calling the cage a compliment." The sentence was harsher than she usually allowed herself, and she regretted the neatness of it almost immediately. Garrett flinched anyway. She corrected herself. "No, that came out like something I practiced. I didn't." Simone glanced toward the floor. "What I mean is you decided where I was most useful, then treated that decision as evidence I wasn't ready for anywhere else." Garrett had no clean response. For once, he did not manufacture one. Later that evening, Luis found Simone replacing the stained temporary procedure with the final laminated version. He held one corner while she aligned it with the edge of the dispatch board. "You applying?" he asked. "For the job?" "Yeah." Simone pressed the laminate flat. "I haven't decided." Luis gave her a sideways look. "That's new. So is having a choice I actually believe is mine." They stood there for another moment while a forklift rolled past carrying sealed medical cartons toward Dock 6. Nothing about the movement looked dramatic. That was the point. The division was functioning again, and this time no one had to pretend one person was the system. Simone did not submit her application when the division manager position reopened on Wednesday. She opened the posting before breakfast, read the criteria twice, then closed her laptop and drove Maya to school. The new process listed operational certification, strategic planning experience, emergency response leadership, and cross-functional management as explicit requirements. 3 years earlier, Simone would have seen the posting as something to win. Now she wanted to know whether applying would be a choice or merely another reflex built from proving herself inside a system that had already taken too much of her time. Maya did not ask what she had decided. She only handed Simone the finished bridge model before getting out of the car and said, "It held more weight after I stopped reinforcing the wrong section." Meridian completed its independent review 2 weeks later. The board published an internal summary naming the failures without turning them into a public spectacle. Garrett had bypassed conflict procedures in sponsoring Owen, applied development standards inconsistently, and allowed inaccurate language into Simone's personnel record after the transition began. The corrected record was placed in her file, along with a formal acknowledgement that her performance had met or exceeded division targets during the period used to justify denying her broader opportunities. Garrett retained his position, but succession authority remained outside his control. His incentive reduction became final, and an external governance consultant was assigned to audit regional promotions for the next year. Owen returned to corporate in a project analysis role without direct reports. Before leaving Baltimore, he spent 3 days documenting the decisions he had misunderstood during his brief appointment. Carrier certification, cross-trained staffing, restoration windows, and the difference between unused capacity and unnecessary capacity. He asked Priya to review the document instead of sending it directly to Simone. That choice told her more than another apology would have. Luis later admitted he had expected Owen either to disappear or defend himself until the end. "People surprise you," he said while checking a doc schedule. Simone smiled. "Usually after disappointing you first." The reforms moved beyond one appointment. Regional leadership roles now required written criteria before candidates were discussed. Family relationships had to be disclosed before sponsorship, not after selection. Development opportunities were tracked separately from performance ratings, so managers could no longer deny an employee exposure and then cite the missing exposure as a reason to hold them back. Emergency Operating Authority also became part of every leadership transition checklist, with customer obligations verified before access or approval rights changed. None of those measures could guarantee fairness. They did make unfair decisions harder to hide inside vague language. The Mid-Atlantic Division stabilized under its interim manager, a veteran operator from Pennsylvania who spent his first week asking more questions than giving instructions. Service remained above target through the winter front. The cross-trained positions stayed funded. Harbor Freight remained one of several certified backups, no longer treated as sacred and no longer dismissed as waste. The division was still Meridian's strongest performer, though the margin over the next region narrowed slightly during the transition. Simone considered that an honest cost. Repair had consumed time, attention, and money. Pretending otherwise would have turned reform into another presentation. On the final day before applications closed, Elaine Porter called Simone into a small office overlooking the yard. "I'm not asking you to apply," she said. "I'm asking whether the process now gives you a fair chance if you do." Simone considered the question. "Yes." "And is that enough?" "No." Elaine waited. Simone looked through the window at Dock 6, where Renee was supervising a refrigerated load beneath the revised dispatch procedure. "But it's something I didn't have before." That afternoon, Simone submitted an application, not because Meridian owed her the position and not because winning it would prove the last 3 years had been worthwhile. She applied because the criteria were visible, the reviewers were independent, and she could walk away if the process failed again. 3 weeks later, she was selected after a panel process that included an external operations executive and 2 internal reviewers with no reporting relationship to Garrett. The offer included the authority that had been stripped from the advisory role, plus a 6-month strategic rotation she had once been told she was not ready to receive. Simone accepted after negotiating one condition. Priya would lead the division's continuity program rather than keeping every critical decision tied to Simone's desk. Spring arrived late that year. On a Saturday morning, Simone sat at the kitchen table while Maya packed the bridge model for a state engineering competition. Her phone rested face down beside a folder containing the first quarterly promotion audit. One flagged case had come from another Meridian region, where a supervisor claimed developmental assignments were being distributed under criteria that looked uncomfortably familiar. Simone placed the folder in her work bag without opening it. Maya lifted the bridge carefully by its base. "Ready?" Simone picked up her keys. "Yeah," she said. "Let's go."